We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
Welcome back. On this special Talking Liberty segment, we're going to continue the evaluation of President Joe Biden's first year, but with a twist. Rather than examine the president directly, we're asking the question, how has the Constitution fared under this presidency so far? Now, there's no one better placed to help us answer that question than Uprising host and Liberty Nation's legal affairs editor, Mr. Scott DeCrescenzo, Esquire. Welcome back to the show, Scott.
Always a pleasure, Mark. Thank you.
So, Scott, how would you rate Joe Biden, 1 to 10, as a defender of the Constitution?
Well, I reject the idea that I can't give him a 0. And I think that's the appropriate grade because, quite simply, I don't think that it factors much into his decision-making or that of his chief aides in decision-making. I think if we take a look, for instance, at the vaccine mandate, it just doesn't seem like, or the vaccine mandates, I should say, plural. It's not that there's just one. There doesn't seem to be much consideration given to the constitutional rights of Americans. It seems to be all about what would we like the policy to be, and then let's go ahead and implement the policies that might get us there, rather than first seeking fidelity to the Constitution.
I think it was Barry Goldwater who said that when asked what he would do is first he would consider whether it was constitutional and then whether it was doable. It's something along those lines, I believe.
Well, that's right, Mark. Goldwater, it's one of his more famous quotes. And he said that I will not attempt to discover whether legislation is needed before I first determined whether it was constitutionally permissible. And boy, when you hear a quote like that, you just think it's such a shame that Goldwater was never president. So,
all right, well, let's go to the Constitution.
Joe Biden, by the way, has not repeated that, to my knowledge, as a rallying call for his own presidency. So that's why I go ahead with the preferred 0 vote on.
Fair enough, Scott. Fair enough. So back to the Bill of Rights and the Constitution. There are many parts made one. Now, which parts did well during Biden's first year in office? Specifically, I want to hear about my two favorites, my two personal favorites, the First Amendment and the Second Amendment. And did the president help or hinder these constitutional amendments?
Well, the expression of and protections of those amendments, I think, has suffered quite a bit under the first year of the Biden presidency. Now, we'll have to see whether that damage is a mere scuff or more lasting. For the First Amendment, I think that the biggest problem that we have and the biggest imposition on it is the discussions with that the administration has, and this, by the way, is not something that I've determined or the people who are in opposition to the Biden presidency have determined. The president and his spokesperson, Jen Psaki, have said themselves that they cooperate or attempt to cooperate with social media organizations to remove the content that they disfavor, whether that's regarding vaccine or health information regarding the coronavirus or other matters. And that seems to be a massive imposition and perhaps unconstitutionally so against the First Amendment rights of Americans. It's one thing if you want to say that, for instance, well, there's some people who think that YouTube should be treated like a utility or forced to put up posts that they would rather take down out of some sort of application of the First Amendment to that. I tend to not favor that because they are a private entity. But when I hear Jen Psaki say that they're communicating with regularly these private actors, and it seems like, getting them to take down the speech of Americans, well, I have to call that a massive imposition on the First Amendment rights of Americans. When the government tells one person, well, yeah, you have free speech, but we'd sure appreciate it if you wouldn't allow Citizen X to speak the words that they are saying. So that's, not that it might be a theme here, but that's a 0, I think, for the First Amendment. And for the Second Amendment, I think the biggest imposition so far has been the attempt to elevate David Chipman to the ATF, head of the ATF. Chipman is a former ATF agent who left the agency and then spent his time away from the agency as a political actor, trying to really ban the most common firearm that's manufactured today and owned by Americans, namely the AR-15. Now, it's one thing if you have an agency head who tries to implement the goals of his superiors, but it's another if they're sort of out there leading the cause in a way that imposes new restrictions on a fundamental right. And I think that's what we had with Mr. Chip. And his candidacy was so bad that Democrats said that they would vote against him, and that's why it had to be withdrawn. So that wasn't just, I think, a political loss for the Biden administration, which is what it was seen as, but also a telling notion of where he is with the Second Amendment, which is to say that he's no supporter of it, and it's under constant threat so long as he's in office and able to move the levers of power against Americans' expression of that right.
Well, fortunately, as you pointed out to me before, America is 50 experiments in democracy. So different states have different measures on in being able to support or even work against the elements of the Constitution. Now, how do you think
the 50 laboratories of democracy?
50 laboratories of democracy.
Yes.
That's right. Now, how do you think Biden's been on maintaining what that actually is? That's 50 individual states cooperating as one United States, e pluribus unum. More specifically, Scott, the power of states compared to the power of the federal government and how that separation works.
Well, Mark, one of the reasons why limited government advocates, generally speaking, did not approve of Biden's bid for the presidency is because he's not somebody who, in word or deed, kind of gives life to the 9th and 10th Amendments, which combine to say that, that what's not limited and enumerated by the Constitution is, giving those powers to the federal government reside both with the states and the people, respectively. So this is more of a, the view of the administration in practice and in word is that there's just not much there in terms of reserving these things for others. It's the federal government has a sort of plenary lawmaking authority. Now, it wasn't Joe Biden who said this, but we saw recently in the vaccine mandate Supreme Court case that Sonia Sotomayor was pilloried for talking about the sort of general police powers of the federal government, of which there are none that are expressed in the Constitution, for instance, unlike state governments, which do have general police powers. So that also, I think we're adding up, that's another zero for the...
0 plus 0 plus
right,
0.
Exactly.
Now,
the power
it's
of
been
zero.
a while since I've done such
I'm not
algebra.
a math major, but...
All right. Now, it's sometimes difficult to rate a presidency, not for you, obviously, Scott, but there's obviously different factors, different times, circumstances applied during different presidencies. For example, COVID. This was, it was clearly something that led to Donald Trump not being in office anymore and to the rise of Joe Biden. But it seems to me, Scott, that if a president goes into office with a goal to booster the nation's founding documents, he or she can't go too far wrong, can they? Or am I being mindlessly naive on this?
Well, it's been a long time since we've had a president, I think, that might have actually gone in with that as more of a talking point. I've said this many times on the Uprising podcast, and I will say it here now. I think that one of the main reasons why Biden was elevated to the presidency is on the promise of no mean tweets. And as far as I know, Mark, he has delivered 100% on that. So just so if we're tallying things up, that is, I think, a promise kept. And I expect him to honor it throughout his presidency. But on the notion that he has somehow bolstered our constitutional rights or the administration's fealty to them or respect for those rights, I'm going to have to go with another big fat zero, unfortunately.
Scott DiCosenza giving the worst score of the day for our Liberty Nation radio show. Scott, thank you ever so much for being here.
Thank you, Mark.
And that's all we have time for on this week's Liberty Nation Radio. I'd like to thank Radio America for hosting and our guests Andrew Moran, James Veit, David Patterson, and Scott DiCosenza. And of course, my sincere thanks to you at home for listening. Let's finish up as we started. Has President Biden been found wanting after his first year in office? Well, that's a question that each voter has to ask themselves. Many in the political realm quote former Clinton strategist James Carville when it comes to who wins at the ballot box. It's the economy, stupid, he famously said. And that has often proved true, but something feels different this time around. Over the last year, we've seen freedoms restricted more than at any other time in recent history. rightly or wrongly, and perhaps that has sparked something that was lying deep and covered. The urge for liberty can be oft overlooked or seem unimportant or non-urgent at times, but when we're reminded that liberty is the lifeblood of all of us, and that without that we are far poorer, and maybe folks will finally look beyond what the talking heads in the fourth estate tell us and demand that the ideals of freedom once again take their rightful place in the halls of power. Thanks for listening. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
We're doing it for real, really real. Liberty Nation.
And Jeff Charles, contributor for LibertyNation.com.
I think we're starting to make an impact. Liberty style, fighting for freedom.
The tracking poll sponsored by Liberty Nation for Thursday.
Mentioned by Dan Bongino, Rasmussen, Jordan Peterson, and
I can
others.
do it again if you want me to.
Cited in Mark Levin's American Marxism.
I think we're starting to make a really big impact. Getting noticed.